Hi guys, so in this tutorial we're going to be treating how to name covalent compounds. In the last one we treated naming of ionic compounds, but here we'll be treating naming of covalent compounds. Sorry, so compounds. Now what are covalent compounds? Covalent compounds are compounds that are made up of the bonding of non-metals and non-metals. Ionic compounds was the bonding of metals and non-metals. Covalent compounds is metal, non-metals plus non-metals. Let me just illustrate this. M plus another N, non-metal plus non-metal. A common example is actually H2O. H2 is a covalent compound because both elements are considered non-metals. Okay, so let's actually get straight into naming. Let me actually put H2O here. H2O, we know it as water, but what would be the compound name? But before we get into it, let's actually have our basics straight. So in covalent compounds, we actually um, put some focus on the number of atoms. We actually give some respect to it. In ionic compounds, we saw it in BaCl2. We didn't actually include the number of atoms of chlorine because we didn't actually consider it or rate it, as the Gen Z would say. So in covalent compounds, we actually put some effort to include the number of atoms. So we need to learn some of the prefixes that we use to represent the number of atoms. So I'll just list a couple here. So prefixes. For one, if there's one atom, only one atom of that element, we use mono. If it was two, we would say di. If it was three, we would say tri. If it were four, we would say what's four? If it were four, we would say tetra. If it were five, we would say penta. And if it were six, we would say hexa. So let's just have these prefixes in mind and keep it somewhere in our brain. So let's use H2O for example. Let's take H2O for example. Let's use red. So if we add H2O, H2O. Okay. Now there are two elements in this compound. We have hydrogen, which is represented by H, and we have oxygen, which is represented by O. Now hydrogen has two atoms. Oxygen has only one. Now we know the common name or the popular name we call H2 is water, but it also has its own chemical name. What is that? Let's take it from the beginning. Let's name it. So the process of naming it is actually kind of similar to ionic compounds. We name the first element and the second element. So we have two atoms of hydrogen. Now what does that represent? Di. What's the prefix rather? Di. So we say dihydrogen, meaning two hydrogen oxide. That's basically it. It's very simple, very direct. Dihydrogen uh monooxide. It's just one O. So it's called dihydrogen monooxide because we have two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. So that is why H2O is named dihydrogen monooxide. Now let's take another example. For example, CO2. That's another very common element, or sorry, compound that we all know. CO2. Now, if we get this, let me write it out. Okay. Now, just like before, we start from the first um, element in the compound. So this compound is made up of carbon and oxygen, one carbon and two oxygen atoms. Now you would expect us to say something like, oh, monocarbon. No, we don't say that. Why don't we say that? In covalent compounds, the first element, if it only has one atom, we don't bother to add the mono prefix. We just write the carbon directly. So that's why it's just carbon. Then the second element, if it's only one atom, like we saw here, we do actually add the prefix. But for the first element in the compound, we don't bother to add it if it's only one atom. So now let's continue. So we have carbon, and then our next element is oxygen, and we have two atoms of oxygen. Now, how do we name this? What's the prefix we would use? Di. So we say carbon dioxide. And in case you haven't noticed, we're not saying carbon dioxygen. No, no, no. We're saying carbon dioxide. So that means the rule of changing the second element or the last element of a compound still stands. The same way we used it in ionic compounds, that we changed it from, let me give an example, salt. We said sodium chloride, not sodium chlorine. Sodium chloride, meaning that even in covalent compounds, we have to change the last element or the second element to end in "ide" as well. Okay. So these are two very common um, elements, oh sorry, compounds that we all should already know. Let me take another one. Now this one is just CO. CO. Now I'll give you about 2 seconds to actually try to name this. Okay. So like I said before, we don't, if the first element only has one atom, we don't bother to add the prefix mono. We just say carbon, like that. Now the second element only has one atom, so we just write, we add the prefix and write monoxide. So this second one here is carbon monoxide. Okay. Whew. Let's take another example. NCl3. Okay. So how would we name this? Just like before, would start from the first element, nitrogen. I hope it's beginning to stick to your head that if the first element only has one atom, we don't add the prefix mono. We just leave it as nitrogen. So now, nitrogen. Now, we have three atoms of chlorine. What prefix matches those? Um, what prefix matches three? Tri. So we say nitrogen trichloride. Sorry, chloride. There we go. Now I want you to try these two questions. Um, H2S, and then the next one, CCl, sorry, CCl4. CCl4. So I give you about 5 seconds. Okay, so let's name this together. You could actually pause the video if 5 seconds is too short, but I'll be explaining how to name these compounds now. So H is hydrogen, and we have two atoms of hydrogen. So we say dihydrogen. Now the next one is S, and S is the symbol for the element sulfur, and we only have one atom, so we just say sulfide. Dihydrogen sulfide. Now let's take a look at the next question, which is CCl4. Now the first one, the first element is C. The second element is Cl, just in case you are a bit confused. Okay, so we have carbon, carbon, sorry, okay, sorry. We have carbon. Now, remember the prefix for that represents four is tetra. So carbon tetra because we have four atoms of chlorine. Tetrachloride. Carbon tetrachloride. So that's basically how we name covalent compounds. Nothing too much, nothing too, difficult. Okay. So now let's learn one more naming for another special kind of functions of compounds. Let's learn the naming of ionic compounds with actual ions this time around. Okay, so now let's learn how to name ionic compounds that contain ions. So there are some common ions that we should at least know or keep stored in our mind. We have OH minus, by the way. Let me put that here, minus. Ooh, this is not going to be nice to use. Let me just illustrate it. So we have something like this. OH minus. We also have NH4 plus. And we also have something like CO3 2 minus. Then let me add one more. Let's take NO3 minus. Okay. So let me give the names of these common ions. So this OH minus, we call it hydroxide. This one here, NH4 plus, we call it ammonium. This one down here, CO2 minus 3, we call it carbonate. Sorry, carbonate. And then this last one down here, we call it nitrates. So these are just four out of the very many ions that we know. But I just want to use these four to illustrate how to name compounds that have ions. So let me just use this line to split the page in two. There we go. Okay. So basically, we could have a question like this. Okay. Um, Okay, so now let's give the names of these examples that I just gave. So Ba, then open bracket OH2. How would we name something like this? Remember, these are ionic compounds, so we don't put into consideration the number of atoms. We don't actually like name it. So Ba stands for barium. Barium. So we start with the first one, that's barium. Then next we move to the ion. So barium. Now what did we call this ion? Hydroxide. So we just say barium hydroxide. Very simple, straightforward, direct. Now let's move to the next one. We start with the first one, calcium. Now what do we call, remember the first element here is Ca. Now what do we call this ion? CO3 2 minus, that is carbonate. So this is just going to be calcium carbonate. Now the next one, this is K, by the way, in case you don't know what my K looks like. This is K. This is NO3. Okay. Now, how would we name something like this? K stands for what? Potassium. So, potassium. And now, what do we call this ion? Nitrates. So, this is just going to be potassium nitrate. Okay. Now, let me give you a couple of questions that you should try and solve on your own. Okay. Let me give it like that in green. So. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to solve this. You can also decide to pause the video because I'll only be waiting about 5 seconds. Okay, so now let's give the answers to these questions. So the first one, we start from the first element, that's sodium hydroxide. The second one, start from the first one, which is NH4. We called it ammonium. So the name of that ion is ammonium. So we say ammonium. We have Cl. So Cl is chloride. So ammonium chloride. Next one is Na2CO3. So Na2 is, oh sorry, let me shorten this. Na2 is sodium. So remember, this is an ionic compound, so we don't actually consider the number of atoms it has. Sodium has 2 atoms here, but we don't really consider it. So we just say sodium, and then the ion, which is CO3. So that's sodium carbonate. Sodium carbonate. Then the last question is NaNO3. So that is just going to be sodium, and NO3 is nitrate. So sodium nitrate. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. I hope you learned a lot. And please, oh, this is not supposed to be compounds. And please subscribe, like, comment, share this video to your friends or whoever you think needs them. And see you in the next video. Thank you.